It's the summer of 1984. School is long done, and with nothing but time to kill, you get to do whatever your heart desires. One of those desires is to jump on the bus and head downtown. There is a stop off at the arcade for a quick game of Galaga before heading to your intended destination, the comic book store. You walk in and are greeted by that familiar smell and head right to your favorite sections. But today, there's something new there. It's a comic book unlike any you've ever seen before. Curious, you decide to give it a shot and make the purchase. You get home and open it up, completely unaware that you are about to dive into what will soon become one of the biggest franchises in pop culture history. I'm Jamie Logie, and this is Everything 80s, a podcast that looks back on a decade that forever changed the way we dress, consume, and connected. And today, we look back on the small joke between two friends that turned into one of the biggest toy franchises of all time. This is part one in the story of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. In this first part, we will explore the origins of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the creators, the release of the original comic book series, and its early growth and success. In this episode, we will also cover the creation and success of the incredibly popular Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon, which helped take the entire franchise to an even higher level. But like with all good stories, we have to go back to the beginning. In the late 70s and into the early 80s, Peter Laird, originally from Massachusetts, is a talented artist working with some other artists on a comic book called Scat. Laird's contribution was a comic called Worm. The black and white underground magazine had some similarities to Mad Magazine. Kevin Eastman from Portland, Maine, is also an artist and eventually made his way to Massachusetts. One day, a 19-year-old Eastman came across a copy of Scat magazine. Eastman was looking for somewhere to sell his work and thought this might be the place. He found the address and headed over. It didn't appear to be a good fit though, but while there, an artist at Scat passed along Peter Laird's address, believing the two of them should meet. Eastman reached out to him, and eventually the two connected. When Eastman first got to Laird's house, he realized the two of them had a common admiration of legendary comic book artist Jack Kirby. Besides the mutual admiration for Kirby, the two had an immediate rapport. Both of them knew they needed to work together and start their own comic business. One of the first things they did was come up with a name, Mirage Studios. The two of them worked at a Laird's house in Northampton, Massachusetts, drawing and collaborating on new ideas. It's now 1983, and both are trying to make ends meet, but still work on their art. Hopefully, they could create something to sell to a publisher. By 1984, the two began working on a comic called Fugitoid. But while working, the younger Eastman would constantly distract and try to annoy Laird in any way he could. One night, while in this makeshift studio, Eastman whipped up a picture with the intention of just making Laird laugh. It was a drawing of a turtle, standing upright like a human. But to the turtle, Eastman added some nunchucks and a mask, and proceeded to call it a Ninja Turtle. It seemed funny to take the speed and ability of someone like Bruce Lee, but put it on one of the slowest animals. And Eastman thought it was hilarious. In the documentary Turtle Power, Peter Laird explains how he had to try and one-up Eastman by creating his own version of the Ninja Turtle, but with some added improvements. Not to be outdone, Eastman looked to top Laird's creation, this time drawing 4 of these Ninja Turtles. Each one had specific weapons and was posed in an action shot. Above the picture, Eastman wrote the word Ninja Turtles. Laird, however, thought they needed a more descriptive identity and added in teenage and mutant. To Laird, that gave the name a much better flow and a descriptive element. And the origins of this entire franchise really just come out of that one joke drawing. But what the two of them had inadvertently done by giving them a full name and identity was create an entire premise. It was right there on the page. Now, they knew they needed a story to explain why these turtles were the way that they were. How did they become mutants? Why were they teenagers? And how did they appear to master martial arts? This needed to be fleshed out. And fortunately, the two had already discovered how well they worked together. Each had artistic and creative strengths and weaknesses, and those strengths and weaknesses complemented each other perfectly, and it allowed them to work quite seamlessly. They started on a story for these funny turtles as well as creating artwork, and surprisingly, it was coming together pretty organically. The momentum of the creative process propelled them forward. The joke idea was becoming a full comic book. Maybe other people would like this story that amused them so much. But what was the next move? Instead of trying to sell their work to another publisher, maybe they could publish something on their own. This, of course, would require money. The two scraped together what little money they had, along with a small loan of $1,074 from Eastman's uncle. They were all in on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. For the next 2.5 months, both Eastman and Laird worked tirelessly, bringing an entire comic book to life. But since money was tight, one area they had to compromise on was color. The comic needed to be in black and white. Even the cover wasn't full color, but primarily black, white, and shades of red. And the entire thing was printed on cheap newsprint. If you ever read any of the original Ninja Turtle comic books from Mirage, you may remember the ink coming off on your hands. But eventually, the 40-page comic was complete. Everyone knows the origin story of mutagenic ooze spilling onto some turtles to transform them into the Ninja Turtles. But Eastman and Laird took a lot of that inspiration from Frank Miller and Daredevil. In the first Ninja Turtles comic, a truck carrying radioactive ooze is in an accident and one canister hits a young boy in the face. The canister, marked TCRI, then smashes into a boy's aquarium filled with turtles, and both the turtles and the canister of ooze fall into the sewer. This moment is witnessed by a rat that will become their mentor, Splinter. And this origin story mirrors the Daredevil origin. In Daredevil, a young Matt Murdock is blinded by a radioactive substance that falls off an out-of-control truck. The radioactive material ends up heightening all of his other senses, turning him into Daredevil. The name Splinter comes from Daredevil's mentor named Stick. The Foot Clan, or Foot, in the Ninja Turtles is influenced by the deadly ninja clan from Daredevil, known as Hand. Because of the Japanese influence, the Turtles were originally going to have Japanese names, but nothing seemed to be a good fit. Kicking around in the studio was a book on Italian Renaissance artists. Flipping through that book, 4 names stood out: Leonardo da Vinci, Donatello, Raphael, and Michelangelo. But since this was a black and white comic and with the only color appearing on the cover, there's one interesting note. All the turtles wore the same color bandana or mask on their face. Except for different weapons, they look pretty identical. This is something significant we'll get back to in a bit. In that first comic, we also meet their evil adversary and leader of the Foot Clan, Shredder. In this origin story, though, Shredder is defeated and killed. Eastman and Laird originally published a comic called Gobbledygook, and in that comic, they announced the release of their new project, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Because of their limited budget, only 3,000 copies of this first issue were printed. But on May 14th, 1984, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were released to the world. Sale price, $1.50. And if you happen to own one of those from the first release of 3000, I hope you're enjoying your retirement savings. We'll get back to that a little later too. But since they work for themselves, how would they get this book out there? With part of the money the two saved, they took out an ad in Comic Buyer's Guide. Between that and the ad in Gobbledygook, hopefully by mail, they could sell a good chunk of the 3,000 books that were now filling their living room. The approach worked, and they sold enough copies to capture the interest of a few comic book distributors. What was originally meant as a one-off comic book was an instant hit, and within just a few weeks, all 3,000 copies sold out. They had made their money back and a little more, and that meant it was time for a second printing. They doubled their order to 6,000 copies, and the second printing was released in June of 1984, and it also sold out. They seemed to have a minor hit on their hands. And remember, this was supposed to be a one-off edition. To Eastman and Laird, the sale of 9,000 books was an absolute win, so a follow-up seemed necessary. Issue 2 of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was released in October 1984. Entitled TMNT vs. the Mousers, this issue introduced Dr. Baxter Stockman. He's invented a robotic rodent-killing machine called a Mouser. Stockman also has an assistant, the very first appearance of April O'Neil. In this story, Stockman builds an army of Mousers that are robbing banks and plans to blackmail the city. April has to end up making a run from him and ends up chased through the sewers by some of the Mousers when she is rescued by the Ninja Turtles. Eventually, she learns their whole origin story. It was a nice follow-up to the original comic. And then it sold 15,000 copies. Clearly, Eastman and Laird were onto something here. When a third printing of the original Ninja Turtles sold a staggering 30,000 copies, the two realized this was looking like a full-time job, a lucrative story, and one they had full control of. They wouldn't be rich, but it looked like they could earn a living off this, and most importantly, work for themselves. Next, in January 1985, came a second printing of issue number 2. That one sold even more copies. And so far, they've only created 2 stories. Issue number 3, called The Great Chase, was released in March of 1985. It continued from issue 2 with the Turtles discovering their underground lair destroyed and Master Splinter missing. April and the Turtles are on the run, and after he battles the Mousers, Splinter is discovered by guards that take him to Techno-Cosmic Research Institute Laboratories, or TCRI. It turns out this entire lab is actually run by aliens. Issue 3 was yet another hit. 2 more issues were released in 1985, and by the end of 1986, there were 9 total comics out there. And the popularity just continued to grow. The Ninja Turtles were outselling the Avengers. One of those first 9 issues was a crossover comic with another underground comic called Cerebus. This issue sold a staggering 135,000 copies. This is more than the Amazing Spider-Man issue 62 and a Miles Morales Spider-Man from just a few years ago. And remember, this is Marvel we're talking about, in our modern era with massive distribution. Ninja Turtles was a black and white, independently produced underground comic book. It was an incredible moment for Eastman and Laird. Between 1985 and 1986, they also released a micro-series with each turtle getting their own issue. Raphael's story came out in April 1985. Michelangelo's was released in Christmas of 1985. The Donatello issue was in May of 86, and Leonardo's came out at the end of 86. I got them years after the release, but I own first printings of Donatello, Leonardo, and Michelangelo, and they are some of my most prized possessions. It's amazing to hold something from its early existence before it would become a true worldwide phenomenon. But that's not to say the comic books weren't a phenomenon, but at this point, it was just limited to comic book stores. If you grew up in the 80s with an interest in comics, this is when you may have seen the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles appear in your comic book stores. I have a distinct memory of seeing what would have been at least a third reprint of the original Ninja Turtles comic at the big comic book store in my city up on a shelf. It was kind of there as a display, and I remember being captivated by it. What was this comic? Who were these characters? There was no going home and looking it up online. You could only ask in the store, and there was no way they were letting me put my filthy hands anywhere near it. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles really were unlike anything else out at the time. It looked different. It was black and white and had an underground appeal. It seemed counterculture and was quite dark. Was it a parody of all the big mainstream comics out at the time? Were they making fun of the stories and images saturating all comics at that period? Or was it just a really cool and unique comic book? It was probably a combination of all those things. What started as a one-time 40-page comic was now taking the entire comic book industry by storm. For Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird, their dreams were coming true. But that dream was about to grow bigger than they ever imagined.
Everything 80s will return after these messages.
In 1987, only 3 issues of the Ninja Turtles were created, but stay tuned as there would be a good reason for that. By this point in the 80s, a 4th printing of the original comic book was released, along with a 3rd printing of issue number 2. At this point, they could order a much bigger printing of each subsequent issue, knowing they would sell out. So speaking of all these reprintings and original issues, what are these comics worth today? Since the original print release was so small, first printings are incredibly hard to track down. There have been in the range of only around 600 or so that have ever been appraised and graded, but they are obviously worth some serious money. Comic book values are a constantly changing thing, and over the years, a first printing of issue 1 has sold for upwards of $100,000. But in 2021, a 9.8 graded copy of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1 sold for $245,000. That 9.8 is considered practically mint condition, which makes it even more rare. A low-quality first printing can still fetch upward of $15,000. Even lower-graded third printings can still go for thousands. But just finding a first printing in any condition is extremely difficult. Not surprisingly, a lot of forgeries have entered the market, even back to those early days. This makes it even tougher to track down genuine copies. But because of all the printings for future issues, those are easier to track down. As we speak, I'm in the midst of an eBay battle for a second printing of issue number 2. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1 is an amazing piece of pop culture history. The first of anything is always unique, but the fact there are so few of them in existence makes them even more special. I mentioned I have a copy of the Michelangelo standalone comic from 1985, and on the inside front cover is an interesting note from Kevin Eastman. He is warning readers to be on the lookout for counterfeit copies of Ninja Turtles #1. Genuine first print copies, he notes, are now selling between $35 and $100. So, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in the comic book world was an obvious success. Their style was copied by many other publishers, leading to the black and white boom of the mid-80s. And people that rarely went into comic book stores started to show up looking for the unique comic, including a lot of kids. But with so much violence and dark themes, these weren't necessarily kids' comic books, even though they featured turtles dressed as ninjas. With all the extraordinary success, what would be next? What would be the next move for this hot property? More comics? That seemed obvious, as the business had grown enough that Eastman and Laird were able to hire a team and move into a real studio. But should they start doing more comic book crossovers or something more? One of the first ways Eastman and Laird branched out the Ninja Turtles was with a role-playing game. Released in 1985, the paperback book sold upwards of 50,000 copies. All of this turtle success soon captured the attention of Mark Friedman. Friedman, who was a fan of the comic books, worked for a company called Surge Licensing, and he knew a hit when he saw it. What was once an underground comic book was about to go mainstream. Despite the darkness and violence of the comic books, this was still 4 turtles dressed as ninjas. It seemed like an idea that kids would love. It's not like they hadn't been approached about licensing the characters, it's just that Eastman and Laird weren't interested. Mark Friedman was a different story. Friedman traveled up to meet with the 2 creators, but it was a bit of the same spiel as they had already heard. However, the 2 of them decided to give Friedman a chance and gave him around a month to see what he could come up with. Armed with a foam rubber Ninja Turtle, Friedman started to make the rounds, but was dismissed and even laughed out of a lot of rooms. In fairness, without knowing what we know now, it was a bizarre idea. Apparently, even Disney had a brief interest, but they, like a lot of other companies, just couldn't see anything happening with 4 violent turtles. Eventually, Friedman connected with Richard Salas, who worked for Playmates Toys. Playmates was founded in Hong Kong in 1966 and manufactured dolls and action figures for other companies. In the 1970s, they started making a line of preschool toys. Then, one of their first big hits was in 1986 with a robotic tape-playing doll called Cricket.
Hi, I'm Cricket, and welcome to my world. Let's be friends, we'll do things together. We'll have a great old time. Hi, wanna hear a
We're now in the era of Teddy Ruxpin, when electronic talking-based toys like this were the buzz of the industry. And I have a previous episode all about Teddy Ruxpin you can check out too.
Let's be friends, just you and I. I'll be talking to ya.
With 4 of the original comic books as reference, the people at Playmates saw this as a promising idea. But the characters and tone of these books were pretty intense, and a bit too adult for a potential kids' toy. Remember, Playmates primarily made preschool toys, and their target market was in the 4 to 8-year-old category. If the Turtles were going to make it into the mainstream, the characters would have to go through some sort of rebranding. In the very first issue of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Eastman and Laird didn't give them extremely detailed personalities, as they thought this was the only time they would ever release them. The Turtles also looked identical with their same colored bandanas. But as the series grew, so did the Turtles' personalities. Leonardo was the leader of the group. Michelangelo was the prankster. Raphael was a bit more intense, and Donatello was the more scientific and analytical one. The personality of Raphael was partly based on Kevin Eastman, and Donatello was a reflection of Peter Laird. Several characters in the comics would be based on real-life friends, including April O'Neil and Michelangelo. But again, the characters and the themes of the comics were quite intense. However, the characters had that bit of foundation to them, and it was the essence of the Ninja Turtles that could be perfect for a kid's toy. But how do you reintroduce the brand for a subsequent toy release? How do you reintroduce these characters to the world? And for most kids, introduce them for the first time? It was time for a relaunch, and since this is the 1980s, that meant only one thing.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, heroes in a half shell, turtle power.
Before any toys and action figures could come out, Playmates wanted a cartoon series locked in first to gauge if there was indeed an interest in these strange characters. And if there was an interest, kids needed to get up to speed with the characters and backstory. Work quickly began on an animated series. Just like G.I. Joe, Transformers, and My Little Pony, a cartoon series would serve as an introductory commercial to launch the toys and products. The cartoon would provide the history of the Ninja Turtles and introduce the individual characters that would soon appear on toy shelves. For the animation, they turned to Fred Wolf. Wolf is an Academy Award-winning animator who had been involved with shows like Alvin and the Chipmunk, The California Raisin Show, and also created the How Many Licks Tootsie Pops commercial. Fred Wolf would handle the animation for a 5-part miniseries to launch the Ninja Turtles. But one of the first big things was to differentiate the characters. Screenwriter David Wise knew each turtle had to have a specific identity, and that started with their bandanas. Instead of the standard red, Michelangelo would wear orange, Raphael would wear red, Donatello purple, and Leonardo in blue. Each turtle also had their initials added to their belt buckles. Bringing the Ninja Turtles to life was a very talented group of voice actors. Cam Clark voiced Leonardo and Rocksteady. Barry Gordon is the voice of Donatello and Bebop. Rob Paulson provided the voice of Raphael. Paulson, a prolific voice actor, was also the voice of Tripwire and Snowjob from the G.I. Joe series, and he also played Pinky in the Animaniacs. Townsend Coleman was the voice of Michelangelo. Coleman was also the voice of Wayne Gretzky in the animated series Pro Stars. The voice of Splinter was performed by Peter Renaday. Renaday has a connection to a few cartoon shows I have a previous episode all about. He was the voice of Master Blaster in Kid Video, and was the voice of Abraham Lincoln in the Hall of Presidents at Disney World, along with Henry in the Country Bear Jamboree. The animatronics for those attractions were partly created by Ken Forsey, who went on to create a show I just mentioned, Teddy Ruxpin. The voice of Shredder was performed by the great James Avery, aka Uncle Phil from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And April O'Neil was voiced by Renee Jacobs, who also worked on cartoon shows such as My Little Pony and It's Punky Brewster. The first episode of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was released in December 1987, which always seems farther back than I remembered. It was an ideal cartoon. It was bright and colorful, full of action, and really funny. The voice actors perfectly captured the characters, and kids became instantly invested. The series spawned many catchphrases, and ultimately, it was cool. Being cool may seem simple and even intangible, but it's an important thing, as being cool makes you unique. And that made the Ninja Turtles cartoon authentic, with a touch of rebelliousness to it. This was something parents wouldn't understand, but it spoke to kids, especially through the irreverent Michelangelo. The cartoon series explored the origins of the Ninja Turtles and introduced us to Shredder along with Krang from Dimension X. The miniseries was an enormous ratings hit and gave the studio and Playmates enough time to get things ready for a summer toy release, and most importantly, the Christmas of 1988. A second season of 13 episodes was soon commissioned, launching in October of '88 and finishing up perfectly by Christmas of that year. The second series explored more narrative arcs, including the quest for fragments of the Eye of Sarnoth, a crystal full of magical powers. In the second season, we see more of Baxter Stockman, Bebop and Rocksteady, and Shredder trying to open a portal to Dimension X. Even though the Ninja Turtles had found mainstream success with a cartoon series, the franchise still stuck with its comic book roots with the release of a new comic book series to coincide with the show. It was called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Adventures. In a unique move, the new comic was published by Archie Comics. Many wondered why Eastman and Laird wouldn't go with someone like Marvel or DC. I own a first printing of that first issue, and in the back of it, Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird explain how this is one of their most asked questions. They went with Archie Comics because Archie had the appropriate blend of enthusiasm and vision. They were the right company to create an adaptation of the more kid-centered animated series. The first issue of the 3-part miniseries was released in August of 1988, and it only cost $1.25. Keep a lookout if you have one of these lying around, as high-graded copies can go for hundreds and even thousands of dollars. The comic books were a tremendous success, as was the new cartoon series. It didn't seem like it could get any better, but we're soon about to enter one of the biggest toy booms in history. And on that bombshell, it's time to end the first part of the history of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Thank you so much for listening, and make sure you're subscribed to the Everything 80s podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss out on part 2. So thank you for spending your time with me here today. I'm Jamie, this has been Everything 80s, and we will see you soon.